Here's what I'm watching right now, and it represents one of the most damning indictments of our economic system I've seen in years. Walmart, the store that literally built a $1 trillion empire by selling to working class Americans, the place where people go when they can't afford to shop anywhere else, is reporting that their customers are tapped out, traffic is declining, and people are choosing between buying food and paying rent. When Walmart sounds the alarm, when the retailer of last resort starts losing customers because those customers are too broke to afford even the cheapest options, we're not talking about a normal economic slowdown. We're talking about a fundamental failure of the system to provide working people with the ability to survive, let alone thrive. And the people responsible for this disaster, the Federal Reserve, corporate executives, and the political class that serves them, are nowhere to be found with solutions because they're the ones who created this mess in the first place. Let me be crystal clear about what Walmart represents in the American economic hierarchy. This isn't Whole Foods or Nordstrom catering to affluent customers who can weather economic storms. Walmart is where people shop when money is tight. It's where families on food stamps buy groceries. It's where minimum wage workers purchase household goods. It's the economic floor, the place you go when you've already cut everything else from your budget. So when Walmart reports that comparable store sales are disappointing, that traffic is down, that customers are pulling back, what they're really telling us is that the bottom 40–50% of American households are in financial crisis. These aren't people who can tighten their belts a little more. They're already shopping at the cheapest store in America. There's nowhere left for them to trade down to, except not buying things at all. And that's exactly what we're seeing. The political failure here is staggering in its scope and consequences. We have a Federal Reserve that spent years telling us inflation was transitory, that they had everything under control, that their policies were working for everyone. Meanwhile, they were printing trillions of dollars, buying bonds to prop up asset prices, and enriching anyone who owned stocks or real estate while doing absolutely nothing for wage earners. Then, when inflation finally showed up, shocking absolutely nobody who understands how money creation works, they acted surprised and started hiking interest rates to fight inflation. But who did that hurt? Not the wealthy investors who'd already made fortunes from the asset bubble. It hurt working people trying to finance a car, buy a home, or use credit cards to bridge the gap between their stagnant wages and rising costs. The Fed's policies created the inflation, and their solution was to make working people pay the price through higher borrowing costs and economic slowdown. It's class warfare disguised as monetary policy, and Walmart's numbers prove the working class is losing. Corporate greed has played an enormous role in creating this crisis, and Walmart itself isn't innocent here. During the pandemic supply chain disruptions, companies across America, including Walmart and its suppliers, raised prices far beyond what was justified by their actual cost increases. They called it inflation, but what it really was is price gouging enabled by market concentration. When a handful of companies control entire industries, they don't compete on price. They coordinate on raising prices together. Walmart squeezed its suppliers, the suppliers squeezed their workers, and everyone in the supply chain made record profits while working families saw their purchasing power collapse. Walmart's CEO made $25 million last year. The Walton family is worth over $200 billion. And now those same executives are wringing their hands about their customers being too poor to shop. The cognitive dissonance is stunning. You can't pay poverty wages, charge maximum prices, and then act surprised when your customers run out of money. The political class has been completely captured by corporate interests, which is why nothing changes regardless of which party is in power. Democrats talk about helping working families, but won't challenge corporate power or seriously reform the tax system. Republicans talk about free markets, but subsidize corporations and protect monopolies. Both parties serve the donor class, and the donor class wants cheap labor, high profits, and no accountability. So we get symbolic gestures. A slight minimum wage increase here, a small tax credit there, while the fundamental structures that transfer wealth from workers to owners remain untouched. The result is exactly what we're seeing in Walmart's numbers, working people being squeezed until they literally cannot afford to participate in the economy, even at the lowest tier of consumption. This isn't an accident. This is the system working as designed, extracting maximum wealth from labor and transferring it to capital. What makes me furious is the gaslighting from economists and politicians who look at employment numbers and claim the economy is strong. They point to low unemployment rates and say everything is fine. But what they don't tell you is that many of those jobs are part-time, gig work, or service sector positions that don't pay enough to live on. You can have 2 or 3 jobs and still be unable to afford rent, groceries, and health care. The unemployment rate doesn't measure the quality of employment or whether those jobs provide dignified wages. It just measures whether people have any income at all, no matter how inadequate. So when someone like Jerome Powell stands at a podium and talks about a strong labor market while Walmart customers are choosing between food and medicine, what he's really saying is that the metrics he cares about, the ones that matter to his Wall Street friends, look good, and he doesn't give a damn about the reality working people face. The inflation numbers themselves are manipulated to minimize the appearance of the problem. The Consumer Price Index is designed to understate real inflation through substitution effects, hedonic adjustments, and other statistical tricks. When beef gets too expensive, they assume you'll switch to chicken and count that as no inflation. When the quality of products improves, they adjust the price to account for the improvement, making it look like there's less inflation than there actually is. But working families can't eat statistics. They experience real prices at real stores, and those prices have increased far more than the official numbers suggest. Walmart shoppers know this intuitively. They see their grocery bills doubling while the government claims inflation is 3%. The disconnect between official statistics and lived experience creates justified cynicism about whether anyone in power is being honest about the economic situation. Let's talk about the housing component of this crisis, because it's directly connected to why Walmart customers are broke. Housing costs have exploded, both rents and home prices, driven by speculation, corporate landlords buying up properties, and Fed policies that encouraged real estate investment. Working families are spending 40, 50, 60% of their income on housing, leaving almost nothing for anything else. When housing eats that much of your budget, a trip to Walmart becomes a luxury you can't afford. You're choosing between rent and food, rent and medicine, rent and clothing for your kids. The people who created this housing crisis, private equity firms, real estate speculators, politicians who zoned out affordable housing, they don't shop at Walmart. They don't feel the pain of the crisis they created. They're too busy calculating their returns on rental properties to care about the families they've priced out of stability. The student debt crisis compounds everything else. An entire generation is paying hundreds of dollars a month in student loans for degrees that often didn't lead to high-paying jobs. That's hundreds of dollars that could have gone to Walmart purchases, stimulating the economy and supporting employment. Instead, it goes to loan servicers and ultimately to the government and banks that created the student debt trap. The cruelty is that we told these people education was the path to prosperity, loaded them with debt, and then created an economy where their degrees are worth far less than promised, while their debt burden is crushing. And now we're surprised they can't afford to shop at Walmart? This is what happens when you financialize education and treat students as profit centers rather than investing in human capital. The gig economy has destroyed job security and benefits for millions of workers, and this shows up in Walmart's numbers. When you're an Uber driver or DoorDash contractor, you don't have stable income, you don't have benefits, and you don't have any financial cushion. Your income fluctuates week to week based on demand and algorithm changes you can't control. How do you budget for Walmart trips when you don't know what you'll earn next week? How do you plan for anything when you're completely at the mercy of app-based platforms that can deactivate you for any reason? The gig economy was sold as flexibility and entrepreneurship, but what it really is exploitation, taking away worker protections, benefits, and stability while forcing people to absorb all the risk and uncertainty of business operations while companies reap all the profits. Healthcare costs are bankrupting working families, and this directly impacts retail spending. Americans pay more for healthcare than any other developed country and get worse outcomes. Medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy. People avoid necessary medical care because they can't afford it. And even people with insurance face massive deductibles and copays that can run into thousands of dollars for a single emergency. When you're facing a $5,000 medical bill, you're not shopping at Walmart. You're trying to figure out how to not lose your house. The fact that we're the only developed country without universal health care is a political choice, not an economic necessity. We could have a system where people don't have to choose between medical care and groceries, but that would require challenging the insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations that fund political campaigns. So instead, we maintain a system that extracts maximum profit from sick people while driving them into poverty. The breakdown in Walmart's traffic isn't just an economic indicator, it's a moral crisis. We live in the wealthiest country in human history, with productivity levels our grandparents couldn't have imagined, and yet working people can't afford basic necessities at the discount store. Think about what that means. All the technological advancement, all the increased productivity, all the economic growth of the past 50 years has not translated into improved living standards for the bottom half of the population. Instead, all those gains have flowed upward to executives and shareholders, while workers' real wages have stagnated. This is a policy choice. This is the result of deliberate decisions about tax policy, labor law, corporate regulation, and monetary policy. We chose to structure the economy to benefit capital over labor, and Walmart's struggling customers are living with the consequences. The political implications of mass financial distress are dangerous and unpredictable. When large populations of people feel economically hopeless, when they're working multiple jobs and still can't afford to live, when their children have worse prospects than they did, they lose faith in democratic institutions and become susceptible to extremism. This is how democracies fail, not through military coups, but through the steady erosion of the social contract until people are willing to support authoritarian movements that promise to upend the system. We're seeing this play out globally, and Walmart's numbers suggest we're accelerating toward that cliff domestically. You cannot maintain a stable democratic society when half the population is one emergency away from financial catastrophe. Something has to give, and history suggests what gives is usually not peaceful or orderly. The Fed's response to this crisis will be completely inadequate because they're institutionally incapable of addressing the real problem. They'll look at weakening consumer spending, worry about recession, and probably cut interest rates further. But rate cuts don't help people who can't afford groceries. Lower rates might boost asset prices again, which helps wealthy investors, but it doesn't put money in working people's pockets. It doesn't raise wages, reduce housing costs, or make healthcare affordable. The Fed only has one tool: interest rates, and that tool is useless for solving the structural problems of wealth inequality and wage stagnation. But they'll use it anyway because it's all they have, and the cycle will continue. Asset bubbles, inflation, tightening, recession, loosening, new bubbles, with working people getting crushed at every stage. What would actually help Walmart's customers? Policies that directly transfer wealth and power back to workers, significantly higher minimum wages indexed to inflation, universal health care that removes medical costs from household budgets, massive investments in affordable housing that break the monopoly of corporate landlords, student debt cancellation that frees up income for consumption, antitrust enforcement that breaks up monopolies and restores price competition, progressive taxation that funds these programs by taxing wealth and capital gains at rates comparable to labor income. In other words, a complete reversal of 40 years of neoliberal policy that has systematically gutted worker power while empowering corporations and the wealthy. But none of this is even being seriously discussed in mainstream political circles because the people who make policy decisions are either wealthy themselves or dependent on wealthy donors, and they're not going to vote to reduce their own power and privilege. The media coverage of Walmart's struggles is predictably superficial and misleading. Business press frames it as a challenging retail environment or changing consumer preferences, as if this is some natural economic cycle rather than a systemic failure. They interview retail analysts who talk about promotional strategies and inventory management, completely ignoring the elephant in the room. People don't have money. The financial press serves the investor class, so they're not going to run honest analysis of how corporate greed and failed monetary policy have eviscerated working people. That would upset their advertisers and readers who benefit from the current system. So instead, we get sanitized coverage that obscures the class warfare taking place and treats the symptoms rather than diagnosing the disease. Corporate executives and their enablers in government will try to blame Walmart's problems on external factors: global supply chains, geopolitical instability, pandemic aftermath, anything except the policies they actually control. This is always the pattern. When asset prices rise, it's because of their brilliant management and policies. When working people suffer, it's because of uncontrollable external forces. The truth is that Walmart's customer base is broke because of decades of policy choices that prioritized capital over labor, shareholder returns over worker wages, and short-term profits over long-term sustainability. These were choices made by identifiable people in corporate boardrooms and government offices, and those people should be held accountable for the human suffering their choices have caused. The response from politicians will be empty rhetoric about fighting for working families, followed by complete inaction or symbolic measures that change nothing fundamental. We'll hear speeches about the importance of American workers, photo ops at factories and diners, promises to bring back good-paying jobs, and absolutely zero meaningful policy changes that would actually transfer wealth and power to workers. This is political theater designed to channel frustration into electoral participation while ensuring the underlying power structures remain unchanged. Both parties play this game because both parties are funded by the same corporate interests that benefit from the current arrangement. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended to extract wealth from labor and transfer it to capital. And Walmart's numbers prove that extraction has reached unsustainable levels. What keeps me up at night is the human cost behind these statistics. Every data point in Walmart's earnings report represents real families making impossible choices. A parent deciding they can't afford their child's medication, a senior citizen choosing between food and heating, a working person skipping meals so their kids can eat. These aren't abstract economic concepts. These are moral failures of a society that has the resources to provide for everyone, but has chosen to hoard wealth at the top instead. When we see Walmart struggling to sell to its core customers, we should feel shame and rage that we've created an economic system that produces such outcomes in a country of such abundance. But instead, we'll get market analysis and stock price movements while the human suffering continues unaddressed. The class divide in America has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, and Walmart's struggles are a symptom of that divide becoming unbridgeable. On one side, we have executives making tens of millions, shareholders collecting billions, and the wealthy buying luxury goods without a second thought about prices. On the other side, we have working people who can't afford to shop at Walmart, living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in debt, and losing hope that things will improve. This isn't sustainable economically, socially, or politically. Something will break, and when it does, the people who created this situation will be shocked and claim nobody could have seen it coming, even though people like me have been warning about it for years while being dismissed as alarmists. The final insult is that when this crisis fully manifests, when Walmart's traffic declines lead to store closures and layoffs, when those layoffs lead to more people unable to afford basic goods, when the economic spiral accelerates, the same people who created the problem will demand bailouts and government support for businesses while opposing any support for workers. We saw this playbook in 2008 and during the pandemic. Trillions for corporations, means-tested scraps for working people. Socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, and the cycle continues, with each crisis transferring more wealth upward while working people fall further behind, until we reach the point we're at now, where Walmart shoppers, literally the most price-sensitive consumers in America, can no longer afford to consume. This content is for educational and informational purposes only, and represents my analysis of economic conditions, corporate behavior, and policy failures. It should not be considered financial or political advice. The views expressed are my interpretation of systemic issues affecting working Americans and should not be relied upon for making financial decisions. Economic and political conditions can change rapidly and unpredictably. Anyone considering financial or political action should conduct independent research and consult with qualified professionals appropriate to their circumstances.